Tyler Cavalli with KRVN Radio, and today we are joining by fellow Nebraskan and Nebraska's only astronaut, and Clayton Anderson. Clayton, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. I know that you have a lot going on, so we appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Tyler.
So, for those that are new, or trying to, or getting used, or trying to figure out who Clayton Anderson is. Clayton was raised in Ashland, Nebraska, graduated from Ashland Greenwood High School, then went to Hastings College, where graduated and went to Iowa State University. And then you got your master's there of science degree. So, Clayton, let's back up a little bit and talk about your childhood growing up in Nebraska and maybe some of your favorite memories. What do you really, when you think back to Nebraska, what really stands out to you and your favorite memories overall?
Well, it was a small town. Ashland was very small back then, probably less than 1,800 folks, and it was a very cohesive community. You know, I remember stories when we were little and when we were going to elementary school. My aunt lived across the hall from my kindergarten teacher, and when I misbehaved in kindergarten, it didn't take long for that to get back to my mother and father via my aunt. Who lived across the hall from my teacher. So there was not much you could do that was secret in a town of that size.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to that, being in growing up in rural Nebraska, or just our listeners in general, rural Kansas, whatever it may be, knowing the way it's hard to get away with anything.
Yeah, I think that, we were normal kids. We did a lot of sports. We camped out down on the Salt Creek. We would try to build shelters down there out of dead trees and branches and things like that. Being outdoors was what was fun. Being outdoors was what you did back then, with only 3 TV channels that really didn't show much until the evening time. Being outside and playing around as kids was the way to be.
You said playing sports. Was there one that you really excelled at or really enjoyed the most?
That's a good question. So my love was basketball. I was successful as a high school player and tried it for a year in college, but I would end up focusing on football in college. I was a pretty good baseball player, but most schools back then didn't have baseball in their high school curriculum or in college. So that was a summer pastime that we played with the American Legion folks. But as a football and basketball player, I guess those would probably be my 2 best sports.
I also would be remiss for those that are watching this video as well. You have the Tom Osborne polo there. Very appropriate. I'm sure that wasn't by accident.
No, that's the 255, the Tom William Osborne 55 set of clothing that actually Coach Osborne sent it to me as a gift. So, he's always been a mentor of mine. He's been someone I've looked up to my entire career. So it's an honor to be able to wear that for this interview or anytime, actually.
So I assume you obviously grew up as a Husker fan.
Oh, yeah. Go Big Red.
Now, did you go to a lot of games in general? Ashland obviously not being that far from Lincoln.
No, back then, my father and my brother and I loved the Huskers, but we didn't have a lot of money, and being able to get tickets was a little difficult. So what we would do is we would sit around my father's recliner, and he would have the radio going, and we'd listen to Lyle Bremser call the game. And then invariably after every game, we would go outside, my brother and I, and we would throw and kick and run with the football up and down Euclid Street where we lived. And then the following day, when the Omaha World Herald and the Lincoln Journal-Star came out with the big splash of Husker results and the photographs, I cut every one of them out. I folded them gently, and I put them in a shoebox. And I had that shoebox in my closet at home in Ashland for, a long, long time. I think my sister finally got rid of it when we had to sell the house.
Wow. So that's a diehard fan there, right there. Looking for the cuttings and cutting them out. That's good stuff. Again, if you're just joining us, we're talking with Clayton Anderson, a Nebraska native and Nebraska's only astronaut. We're talking about growing up in the Ashland area, going to Ashland Greenwood High School. But there's not obviously, with you being the only astronaut in Nebraska so far, how did that idea for you really originate? I mean, where did that come from? I mean, there's not a lot of opportunities around here to even get interested in becoming an astronaut.
Well, I think if I tell the entire story, I can kind of condense it down. But in 1969, my mom and dad awakened my brother and sister and I and put us in front of a black and white TV in Ashland around 12:30 at night on Christmas Eve to watch the Apollo 8 astronauts go behind the moon for the first time. As a young 9-year-old, that's my first recollection of the time that I was really captivated by the idea of going to space. Now, my mom, she would have told you that it was at age 6, 3 years earlier, that she and I would have discussions and that I would talk to her about becoming an astronaut. And so much so that in Ashland in the summer, we have the stir up days where we stir up trouble, stir up excitement, stir up fun. And we had a kiddie parade back then, and little kids would wear a costume and we would march for a block in front of the judges, and they would rate our costumes, and then they would give us ribbons. Blue was first place, red was second place, and white was third. And Mom wrapped me in tinfoil and put a hat box on my head that had a slot for my eyes, a place for it to go around my head, and then on the top, she had a styrofoam ball attached to a pipe cleaner so I could talk to the aliens. And she wrapped every single bit of me in aluminum foil, and I walked in that parade as a Mercury astronaut.
When you were walking in that parade, did you ever get any signal from extraterrestrials out there?
If I tell you, Tyler, I got to kill you. So I can't tell you.
All right. Well, after this interview, you and I can discuss it. How about that?
That's fine.
So you began your loving for it, being an astronaut at a young age, but what is the process? As we mentioned, you went to Hastings College. You then, after that, got your master's at the University of Iowa State University, I should say. How do you go about that and trying to further that dream?
Well, Hastings College played a big part in this, in actuality, and it turns out that a gentleman from Hastings College's class of 1961 was working on the second floor of Building 30 in Houston, Texas at NASA at the Johnson Space Center, and his name was Maynard Huntley. And Maynard would come up to Nebraska every fall to hunt pheasants. And it just so happened that my senior year at Hastings in 1980/81, Maynard came up to hunt pheasants, and he hunted with the career guidance counselor at Hastings College, who was a guy named Gary Musgrave. And those two guys got to talking, walking through the woods, and said, "Hey, what do you do?" "I work for NASA." "Oh, you do? We have a kid here at Hastings College who loves NASA." "Oh, you do? Well, does he know we have a summer internship program?" "Well, I don't think he does." "Well, we should get him the information." "Well, could you send?" "Yes, I can send." So all this transpires in a cornfield somewhere where these guys are stomping through the field looking for pheasants. And it would turn out then that the information did get to me, and I applied for a slot as a summer intern in Houston at the Johnson Space Center. And that summer, 480 people applied for 40 slots. And I was fortunate enough, with the help of Dr. Sackelman from Hastings College, to sit on the phone and do a phone interview with a man named, I think his name was Bob Jones from Houston. And they hired me as a summer intern. So I would travel to Johnson Space Center in Houston for the first time in my life in 1981 to start work for the summer there. And once I had my foot in the door, I found out who the appropriate people were to chat with. I went to chat with the head of the astronaut selection program and asked him questions about what I should do. How do you do it? What are best ways to become selected? And I guess that's the rest of the story, right? I never left, really. I came back to Iowa State to finish my graduate degree, but went back for a second summer internship, after which NASA hired me full time. So now, at the very least, I was working for NASA, a place that I dreamed to work and a place that I loved. Now, whether I was going to become an astronaut or not, that would be frosting on the cake.
So when you were doing this entire internship for these 2 years, were you trying to aspire to be an astronaut, or was it at that point, hey, I'm at NASA, as you mentioned, life's good?
I think life was good. You know, the first summer, they didn't know what to do with me. I have an inkling that I was probably the first intern that they'd ever had in the organization that I was working in. And so I was fighting to stay awake and not be bored. So I worked problems from my differential equations book at my desk in Houston for NASA just to have something to do, right? They would give me tasks and I would finish them so quickly that they didn't have anything else to give me. And so rather than figure out how to keep me engaged, you know, I spent a lot of time just trying to figure out ways to engage myself.
So you do that for 2 years. You mentioned that you went to Iowa State, got your master's there. How did it all then transpire after that? Did you decide, I'm going to really pursue this of really becoming an astronaut and see where this takes me?
Well, the second internship, I had requested to go to an organization that did more of the things that I'd studied at Iowa State. And NASA accommodated that. And I actually enjoyed that summer very much. I was very engaged. I had great mentors. I got to do a lot of cool things. And I actually came up with my thesis topic for my master's degree while working at NASA. So those guys, that group was the group that then hired me the following year in 1983. And that was the point that I thought, you know, I can do this. And I put in my first application to become an astronaut. It would turn out, unfortunately, that that was the first of 15 applications over 15 years. And I wouldn't even get a sniff of interest until year 13.
Yeah, I want to talk about that process of actually becoming and being accepted as an astronaut. You mentioned 15 times being rejected. First off, let's start there. Was there ever a time where you said, all right, this is maybe just not in the cards for me? What really kept you going and keep applying?
Yeah, that was just before year 13. I had applied 12 years in a row. I'd never heard anything from anyone except, hey, we got your application. Thanks for playing. And my wife and I we took a trip to Seattle, Washington with the idea that I might get an interview at Boeing in Seattle. We had a lovely time up there. The job interviews didn't really come to fruition up there. So we returned back to Houston, and I think I was probably at my desk for less than a week when I got a phone call from the astronaut selection office that they wanted to interview me. And once they decided that they were going to interview me, that was a huge boost to my ego and my willingness to keep fighting and trying to become an astronaut. So that first interview in the 13th year, which would have been 1996, was a very important thing. It lit a fire in me again to continue trying because, you know, honestly, my wife and I thought, well, they're never going to pick you. Maybe we should move on and do something else.
What qualifies someone to become an astronaut?
Good question. So there are some basic requirements, right? You have to have reasonably good health, reasonably good eyes, no medical issues in your background, but you also have to have a technical upbringing in science and engineering and mathematics. So there are a lot of ways you can do that. You can be a med student, a veterinarian, you can be an aerospace engineer, a chemical engineer, a physicist, you know, lots of ways to satisfy their requirements, including being a fighter pilot or a helicopter pilot in the military. I didn't have any of that going for me, but I did have the scientific engineering background as a civilian mission specialist. So that's how I applied. You know, if you think about how competitive it is, in my 15th year, when I finally got selected, approximately 2,600 people applied, and they only picked 25 of us Americans. So that's about a rate of 1%. If you fast forward to today with the internet, we're talking 20,000 applications, and they're picking less than a dozen at a time. So that really drops that percent way down. So I was pretty lucky to actually get selected when I did.
You've been talking about all these occupations that would help you become an astronaut. Radio broadcaster was not listed on there. So my chances are very slim, is what you're saying.
Well, you know, with all the money you guys make in radio, you could probably become one of those astronauts just by paying Elon Musk or
That's
Jeff
true.
Bezos some coins. So get after it.
Yeah, it's never been easier now than it ever was. That's for sure. Again, we're talking Nebraska native and Nebraska's only astronaut, Clayton Anderson, joining us here. Clayton, after you were officially accepted, an astronaut now, what is that process like of, okay, now, I mean, do they basically immediately set you up, say, you're going to go into space at this time or this time down the road? What is that process like of becoming an astronaut? I read your book, The Ordinary Spaceman, and I think I remember one part in there. You said riding in the fighter jets, I believe, and almost or trying not to puke, or you did puke. Talk about all that experience.
Yeah, that was the T-38 training jet, and yeah, that was the whole mission, was to try not to puke in the airplane. And but what NASA does typically, it would be really nice if they would tell you once they choose you that they're targeting you to fly, and 5 years from now, 10 years from now, whatever it is. But you don't get that. Basically, they put you on a training plan that will get you ready to fly eventually, but you really have to do a job. They're training you to do a ground job to support all the astronauts that are flying at the time. And that's how they gauge your capabilities, right? They're looking at you all the time. It was hugely competitive. We had to take exams. We were the first class that had to sit in a classroom and take exams on the subject matter. They videotaped us so that we wouldn't cheat. They rated us in rank of performance in the simulator without our knowledge. I mean, they were doing a lot of crazy stuff because the competition was so intense. But eventually, in a group like that of 25 U.S. astronauts plus 7 internationals, the 32 of us, you start to separate yourself out, right? And they see who has the most capability that they're looking for. And then they begin in secret to figure out who they want to fly and when. And you don't really hear about that. That's kind of behind the scenes with the management. You just keep doing your job until one day you get that call where somebody says, "Hey, we want to put you on flight X." And I'm assuming they still do it that way today.
Your voyage into space came June 8th, 2007 as part of say if I'm wrong here, Expedition 15 and 16 crew. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was actually part of the Atlantis crew, the STS-117 crew, who carried me up to become then a member of the International Space Station Expedition 15. And the anniversary of that launch is tomorrow, June the 8th, which would have been my dad's 77th birthday. So,
Wow.
Yeah, that's a big day, big anniversary for me tomorrow.
Very special. Wow. This is happy accident. I guess we're discussing this now and you can relive that. So you get this, you get told that you're going to be going into space at this time. What is that feeling like?
Well, there was a ton of excitement, but a lot of anxiety, right? I was leaving the planet for the first time, never done it before. I was going to end up leaving my family behind for at least 5 months. And my kids were young. Cole was 10 and Sutton was 6. And my wife was working a full-time job at NASA. And now her life partner, was going to be gone. So she'd have to assume all the roles and responsibilities of parenting and driving the kids to their games and their concerts and all that sort of stuff. So she cut back on her hours and sacrificed her career so that I could do this. And I'll forever be in debt to her for her willingness to do that. Susan was doing quite well at NASA in her own light and was moving up the ranks on her side of the organization. So for her to sacrifice like that was a big deal. And it was stressful for all of us, especially the time leading up right before launch.
You're strapped to this rocket. It gets going. What is that feeling like? I mean, physically, what's going on in your mind as you take off from Earth?
Hey, Lord, don't let me make a mistake. My first launch, I was sitting on the middeck, which was where my seat was on the shuttle Atlantis, which means you don't have any windows. So you really don't know what's going on except through your ears. Everything you hear and your training tells you where you are in the launch countdown, how close you are, how things are going. And fortunately for us, it was going really well that day. We didn't have any issues going uphill. And then the time, I guess the last 10 or 15 minutes when it really gets serious, that's when your focus kicks in. And I was so focused on what I had to do and when I had to do it, such that no one would have to rely on me or count on me making a mistake, right? You don't want to be the person who messes something up in the chain of events, because that can have hiccups down the road. So I had my checklist out and I was looking at over and over and over again to make sure I knew exactly what I was supposed to do, where I was supposed to put my gear, what systems I was going to activate as soon as I got out of my chair. It was actually quite exciting. And then to get to space and be weightless, you really couldn't enjoy it because you had so much work to do. I remember when I finally got a break and I could float up briefly and look out the shuttle windows at the Earth, it was probably one of the most amazing sights that I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, I can only imagine what that was like looking out over the entire world. You then spent 152 days on the International Space Station. You were the mission specialist. Is that correct?
I was one of them. So on the shuttle crew, I was mission specialist 7, which essentially I was a sack of potatoes. They called me the SOP, and they were basically just going to push me across the hatch and then be done with me. When I got on the station, I was called Flight Engineer 2, which meant that there were 2 Russian cosmonauts who were the leaders, the commander of the mission and the flight engineer number 1. And I was basically the 3rd team member. So a lot of times you have those monikers that they give to you, but they really don't matter because you're all on the same team and you're doing what you need to do to make everything successful.
So you're up there for 5 months. You're inside the International Space Station. What are you doing up there the entire time? I mean, you're not obviously you're going around the world all the time. You're looking outside. I mean, what's there to do?
Oh, Tyler, there's tons of stuff to do. So back in those days, we were still assembling the space station. So we were doing spacewalks to bring physical pieces together. And then we had to connect the hydraulic lines, the fluid lines, the electrical lines, all that sort of thing. But then you get inside and you have to make sure that the systems are all accommodating for the new pieces that you brought in. So we were constantly working on making sure that the systems inside were compatible with what we did outside. We were doing some science experiments, not a lot at that time because the focus was more on kind of outfitting the space station. If you can imagine that you're working on your house and you're making sure that everything's going good with your home. And as you move in, you're bringing the furniture in, you're making sure the gas is connected, the electricity, all that kind of stuff.
What was it like being outside the space station when you did your spacewalks? I mean, what is that feeling like of being literally just in outer space?
That's probably the most wonderful memory of my entire career was my first spacewalk. When the hatch was opened, it was pitch black. The Earth was blocking the sunlight, so it was pitch black. I was hanging on with one hand on a handrail. Just all I could think of was, as I looked out into the blackness of space, that I was born to be right here in that place at that exact moment, doing that exact thing. So then when you go outside of the hatch, it's time to go to work. And again, the training takes in and the focus takes in, and you don't want to make any mistakes. And so it's very mentally taxing that you're thinking through everything you do. You're trying to do it exactly as you practiced it on Earth in the swimming pool in Houston. You're relying on your partner, who at that time was Russian cosmonaut Fyodor Yurchikhin, who was a very able spacewalker. But I was in charge. I was responsible. And so that was a heavy weight on my shoulders to make sure that we were doing everything that we needed to do.
When you were up there for that amount of time, could you figure out when you were coming close to Nebraska? Did you try to pinpoint every time that you guys were flying by Nebraska or United States and try to figure out, and could you even see Nebraska at that point?
Oh yeah, you could figure it out if you had a chance to look. I remember One of the tasks was I was going to throw away a huge tank of ammonia that we didn't need anymore. That was about the size of a double refrigerator in a restaurant. And I remember holding on to it. I couldn't see except if I turned my head and looked a little bit to the right or left. And we were actually coming in over Nebraska at first, and I wanted to jettison it over the state if I could. But it would turn out that we didn't have communication at the time, and that was one of the requirements. We had to be in communication with the ground, so we had to wait and pause. And I think I ended up throwing it out over Saudi Arabia or somewhere. But I was always looking for Nebraska, but you're so busy working that there are certain times you can't see it. And I remember the first time I was prepared to see it and take photos of it, I couldn't, because as I finally figured out where I was, and I saw us coming in over Montana and then through South Dakota, and I was going to pass right over Omaha and Lincoln. And when I figured out where the Missouri was and the Platte River was, and I saw that big gray blob that was Omaha and the small gray blob that was Lincoln, and then I located Ashland, I couldn't take any photos. I just cried. I was so emotionally overcome by the fact that here I was 240 miles above the place I grew up, where the people raised me. And it overcame me with emotion. So I had to wait till the next time.
But you did get some pictures.
Absolutely, I did. Later on, I got some great pictures. I got a picture of Memorial Stadium on October 26th against the Texas A&M Aggies with an 800 millimeter telephoto lens that shows clearly the big red, the third largest city in Nebraska. And I captured a picture of my hometown. I captured a picture of the Rosenblatt Stadium. Just anywhere I could think of, I captured as many pictures as I could.
We're going to talk a lot about what life was like inside the space station. I know you talk about that as well in your book, with us running close to time here. But when you were coming back to Earth, you came back on November 7th, 2007. What was that feeling like? You spent all this time, 152 days in outer space, International Space Station, just looking at Earth from above. And now you're coming back. What was that feeling like, coming back to Earth?
Well, when I left the station, we had a handover ceremony with Dan Taney, who was taking my place. Peggy Whitson from Iowa had just arrived about 3 weeks earlier with her crewmates. And so I was going to leave, and it was very emotional again. It was a very sad time for me, right? I put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in a 9-year career as an astronaut before ever getting a chance to fly. And now it was ending, and I had no idea if I would get a chance to go again. I was elated that the shuttle Discovery had reached the station such that I could go home. I was hugely excited to see my wife and my children again. And I think that's what took my focus, right? I was coming home to be with my family again. And that was the most important thing. At the time, my mom, Alice, was battling lung cancer. And so I hadn't known through my 5 months if she would even be alive when I came home. So fortunately for us, she survived until I was able to see her the day after I landed. And it would turn out that was the last time I ever got to touch her or talk to her. She would pass away 3 weeks later.
Goodness. So you leave. I mean, really, the dates of you leaving and then coming back is obviously, in many ways, obviously days you'll never forget, but just ceremonial, I guess, to you.
Yeah, it was very important to me emotionally and to my family. In addition, I landed at the Kennedy Space Center on November 7th, 2007, which was my wife and my 15th wedding anniversary. So you launch on your dad's 77th birthday, and you come home on your 15th wedding anniversary. You do a spacewalk, and you see your home from space. I mean, I think I was born to be an astronaut. I was born to do this. I was born to be Nebraska's first. I just hope I'm not the last.
Well, before we go, you've had a busy life post being an astronaut. You've written several books, as we've alluded to many times, called The Ordinary Spaceman. I highly suggest everybody pick that up if you haven't already. But you've also written multiple children's books. And do I understand there's another book that you'll be releasing soon? Talk about all that.
Yes, I've written A is for Astronaut and Letters from Space. I've written The Ordinary Spaceman, which is my memoir, and another Q&A question and answer book called It's a Question of Space. My fifth book, my third children's book, So You Want to Be an Astronaut, comes out next year, hopefully early next year in 2023, with Sleeping Bear Press. And I'm actually in Austin today speaking, getting ready to go speak to a group of educators about my new book. So I hope everybody will go to astroclay.com and check out the books, check out the ability that you can purchase photos, autograph photos, and memorabilia. Lots of cool stuff on astroclay.com.
Well, Clayton, we certainly appreciate your time today, and thanks for sharing your memories of being an astronaut, growing up in Nebraska. And again, you have several books that people can check out as well and relive some of these memories too. So, Clayton Anderson, thank you very much for joining us.
You bet, Tyler. And just to let everyone know, I'm now running the Strategic Air Command and Aerospace Museum in my hometown of Ashland, Nebraska. So I would encourage everybody to come out and visit this wonderful museum, and perhaps you'll get a chance to shake the hand of an astronaut.
There you go. He is Clayton Anderson. He is Nebraska native and Nebraska's only astronaut. Tyler Cavall reporting for KRVN.